I am so sick of movies always using product placement everywhere. Welcome to Module 6, Lecture 15, where we are wrapping up our module on international law and international organizations with a discussion about humanitarian intervention. So let's start off with some definitions to get us on equal footing. Humanitarian intervention means intervention almost always involving the use of force for humanitarian purposes, typically in situations of genocide, armed conflict, or severe humanitarian crisis, especially massive famine. An intervention itself is coercive interference, usually involving the threat or use of force against the sovereignty, territorial integrity, or political independence, or any matters essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of a state. So let's talk a little bit about the history of humanitarian intervention in the international system. So after World War II and up through the end of the Cold War, the United Nations Security Council did not authorize a single intervention against genocide, despite genocides happening in places like East Pakistan, Cambodia, and Uganda. But then things changed after the Cold War ended. And from the 1990s onward, the UN Security Council has authorized humanitarian interventions in places like Bosnia and East Timor, and also launched peacekeeping operations across the African continent in places like Sierra Leone and Liberia. So what about the scope of this term? Where does it apply? How do we know when it's appropriate? Let's begin to have that kind of a discussion. So the existing right to humanitarian intervention applies only at this point to genocide, which is the systematic elimination of a particular group of people. But the paradox herein is that the international community is willing to respond to certain kinds of graphic and concentrated suffering, like a genocide, but not diffuse forms of suffering, like malnutrition. This may be because they simply respond to different kinds of acts. It may be easier to identify the perpetrators, whereas it may be more difficult if we're trying to understand how malnutrition occurs on a mass scale. It could be a confluence of factors like climate factors, infrastructure, the actions of elected officials. So how exactly do we know who to point the finger at, or what is the appropriate course of action remains to be seen in these kinds of situations. But we know that the international community, when it does act, it acts in places where it's more obvious that mass suffering is occurring at the hand of one or several people or a group of people through things like a genocide. So then we get to the question that's pertinent for this particular module, which is humanitarian intervention legal? And this was a topic of discussion in the Ian Hurd article that you were reading for this module. So on the one hand, you can point to international law and say, no, humanitarian intervention is in fact not legal. Why? Well, Article 2, Section 4 of the UN Charter states, all members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. So there's really strong language here, right? The words shall refrain are extremely strong as far as legal words are concerned. And it means you cannot do something if it's proscribed by the law. In addition, Articles 24, 39, and 42 of the UN Charter transfer the right to use force to the UN Security Council as long as it pertains to, quote, the threats to international peace and security. Remember, the United Nations was set up in part to deal with collective security issues. And so one of the deals that states struck in the process of creating this institution was that they would willingly concede some of their own decision-making authority to this international body, and in response, the international body with the UN Security Council at the head would make sure that the threats to international peace and security would not go unattended. On the other hand, you can make an argument that yes, in fact, humanitarian intervention is legal. So some people might argue that Article 2, Section 4 of the UN Charter is no longer valid because countries have repeatedly violated this part of the Charter. So this kind of gets back to what we talked about in the previous lecture on the sources of international law. Custom is an important source of international law, and it's the practice of states that eventually, over time, can be concretized into that body of international law. So if states are repeatedly flouting Article 2, Section 4, it suggests that maybe it's out of date. The question that emerges is then, how many states need to reject Article 2, Section 4? Over what kind of a period of time does this need to happen? These are questions that are not completely settled by international legal scholarship, but there can be an argument made that, in fact, if we recognize that countries are no longer following something, they're persistently objecting to it, if you will, then it might no longer be a valid international law. And in this situation, we have seen a transition from, or in the increasing prominence of humanitarianism more than the component of sovereignty known as non-intervention. So in this kind of a scenario where humanitarianism is viewed as more important than non-intervention in a state's affairs, this is what we would call constructive non-compliance. Because you're not complying with international law as it is written, but it's constructive in the sense that it's providing some good, right? Some measure of security and hopefully saving people's lives. So in this sense, sovereignty and humanitarian intervention can be seen as complementary and not contradictory, because you may need to intervene, the argument goes, in order to preserve the sovereignty and the territorial integrity of that state. If the state is eroding because of a dictatorial leader who is killing his own people, well, that state is incapable of governing itself in the way that a state should be able to, and that involves things like protecting the rights of your citizens. So if you intervene with the goal of restoring sovereignty, then humanitarian intervention is actually not so much a threat to sovereignty as it is serving to concretize and re-emphasize its importance. In a separate chapter, which I didn't have you read, but I'm just going to show you briefly these arguments, Jack Donnelly, who has written a lot about international human rights, has come up with several categories of justifiability that help to explain whether humanitarian intervention might be allowed or might not be allowed. So at the apex of justifiability is when humanitarian intervention is authorized. And that means that intervention fully meets all relevant standards. And the two most important ones that we've talked about in this lecture are that a noticeable genocide is occurring and that it adheres to international law, especially under the UN Charter. So where it at least meets that minimum criteria, you can make an argument that humanitarian intervention might be authorized. Taking a step down from that, it's also possible that humanitarian intervention can be merely permitted. And this is where intervention is neither authorized nor prohibited. So in this kind of a situation, you may have actors that are actively speaking up against or objecting to the use of humanitarian intervention for one reason or another. That doesn't mean that they are correct, but they are lodging some kind of complaint about whether this is allowable, and therefore there's some kind of dissension within members of the international community, so it could be permitted even though there's some objection to its use in this particular context. Going one step down from that is where it is fully contested. And this is where there are different standards that point in different directions. And Jack Donnelly talks about kind of two subdivisions within this, which we will review briefly. One is where humanitarian intervention might be excusable. And this is where intervention is unjustified, but it might be allowable by appealing to conflicting but subordinate standards. So the example in the book that he gives of this is if we are to evaluate whether it's lawful or not for someone to steal food for their family. So on its face, right, stealing food from a food vendor or from a grocery store, that's illegal. It's theft. On the other hand, you can point to what they did and the intent that they had and the rationale or motivation that they had for engaging in this unlawful act and understand that their heart was in a good place and that people weren't necessarily left worse off and that at least from a moral standpoint, it might not be objectionable that someone took that course of action. So here we can identify that sort of violation of the law as excusable because there was some really solid intent behind it. But a variation of contested that's different is known as where humanitarian intervention is merely tolerable. And this is where intervention is justified, but because the outcome was positive or the lesser of two evils. So here, in this kind of a situation, we might observe someone or a country intervening into the affairs of another country to throw out an evil dictator, but they then install their own dictator who's not necessarily as bad, is not maybe killing people or producing mass starvation or anything like that. So they're replacing one dictator with another who's slightly better than the one that was in place prior. So here, you can make the argument that the humanitarian intervention engaged by that country was tolerable because it rooted out a force for evil in that country, but it might have replaced it with something that was only slightly or marginally better than what was there initially. And then the final category is intervention that is justified but failed. And this is where the results of the intervention don't matter at all. Countries may have had the capability, the legal standing, a genocide, sort of fit all of the general criteria that you might need in order to justify engaging in humanitarian intervention, but it's ultimately something that fails. And so what we're going to talk about in the next couple slides are questions motivated by, in part, some of these variations of justifiability and the legal basis for intervening where a country may be undergoing genocide or other kinds of humanitarian crises. So let's start off with some of these probing questions. So why do states intervene in some places but not others? As social scientists, of which political scientists are part, we want to understand consistency and patterns, but we also want to understand variation. So why do we witness variation in some places and more consistent behavior across others? So perhaps, for example, some have made the argument that the international community intervenes in places where it's deemed that there are national interests at stake for some of the more important actors that will be engaging in these kinds of humanitarian activities. This is kind of a skeptical view, but it suggests that there are some places where members of the international community who would be called upon to act in the event of a crisis, they only do things out of self-interest. And so this has the effect of supporting the realist argument that the international institutions are really the puppets of the most powerful states. And this gets to this general question about whether the inconsistent use of humanitarian intervention makes any kind of statement about the usefulness of international institutions. Because the argument goes, if the international institutions are just pawns of the most powerful countries, then they're really just funneling or channeling their own national interests through these institutions. And so the institutions like the UN, like the World Trade Organization, like the International Monetary Fund, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, they don't serve purposes that are separate from the states that created them and have an important stake in the decisions made by those organizations. Does this mean that international institutions are useless? Does it mean that international institutions are weak and need to be strengthened? Do we need to more consistently apply the criteria for engaging in humanitarian intervention in order to justify the continued existence of international institutions? What about the policymakers themselves? How can they balance the need to address important questions with the need to act quickly to prevent further loss of life? This is a real challenge, right? If there's evidence from Human Rights Watch that there's a genocide going on in the Congo, and every single day humans are being killed and no one's doing anything to stop it, do we pause and have an extensive discourse and deliberation about whether this will be an interference in the domestic happenings of a particular state, or do we act first and then ask questions later? This is an important question, right? Because every moment when there's a possible genocide that's going on, that transpires, more lives are lost. So the longer countries take to deliberate, and the longer that international institutions take to make a decision about whether they should deploy peacekeeping forces or some kind of coalition of armed forces, the more likely it is that the body count will continue to increase. So how do policymakers balance these competing interests? We'll close with three more questions. Can inaction in humanitarian crises ever be justified? Is it possible that maybe the consequences for the intervening countries are so potentially great that it might be impossible to curry support for engaging in humanitarian intervention? Think about, for example, not a genocide necessarily, but say a natural disaster. And there are people who are dying in a country in the South Pacific, and countries are wrestling over this idea about whether or not they should intervene and provide some kind of support for the people on the ground who've been ravaged by, say, a typhoon. But in doing so, they put their own people at risk. So what if countries decided that it's not important enough to put our own people at risk and that we are better off, in a kind of Darwinian sense, letting the strong survive? Could you ever envision that being a justifiable argument for not intervening in a particular humanitarian crisis? What about thinking about the role of domestic politics? Should leaders of individual countries rely on public opinion when deciding whether or not to intervene? In the United States, it's usually not particularly popular to engage in international activities where there's not a direct national interest at stake. So is it the case that the United States should listen to public opinion, and so the president, whomever that might be, should either act or not act based on what their constituents want? What about if the president wants to make a particularly strong stance about their alliance with a country that is undergoing some kind of humanitarian crisis? Or the leaders of a country want to signal that they have very strong moral and ethical obligations to other countries because they really promote the importance of human rights. Well, would that mean that it would be permissible to ignore people in the home country who argue that that country shouldn't be engaging in activities abroad, even if they are for humanitarian purposes? The United States, during the decision-making process leading up to the war in Iraq in 2003, right, had to decide whether it was permissible to enter Iraq because they might have weapons of mass destruction or because Saddam Hussein was a dictatorial leader who was causing harm to his people. And remember that the government at the time, under the Bush administration, tried to initially couch its argument or frame it under the guise of weapons of mass destruction. And then when that didn't really show a lot of strength in terms of the evidence we would need to prove that, we moved away from that and went toward we need to liberate people from the Hussein regime. So, but in countries like the United States and other places, public opinion tends to be very strongly opposed to this kind of activity abroad. And so you have people, getting back to the previous slide, who argue that maybe the United States intervened in a place like Iraq because of national interests, specifically those relating to energy and wanting to remove itself from being dependent on oil from other countries like Saudi Arabia. So should we be motivated by public opinion? That's a question that's open for discussion. Does the international community have an ethical obligation to intervene in cases of genocide? Is it the case that we should not pay as much attention to the law because maybe the law has yet to catch up with what the international ethical arena is arguing? And so could we see past international law where we have a strong ethical obligation that is being argued by members of the international community, especially where genocide is relevant? Finally, I got one last question here. How does the history of success or failure of humanitarian intervention affect future decisions to intervene? If we look at the history over time, we've covered sort of two periods, right? That post-World War II to the end of the Cold War, and then from the Cold War onward. So if we look at when we decided to intervene and when we decided not to, should we use that information to guide whether we should do it in the future? What if it's the United States that is undergoing a humanitarian crisis? Do we want other countries to contemplate for several months whether any kind of humanitarian crisis is occurring? Meanwhile, the loss of life may continue to accrue, and the United States may be pleading for the assistance of other countries. So should other countries look in those kinds of instances to whether we were successful in small African countries in the 1990s, or whether we should have gone into places throughout the 2000s and didn't, and so the outcomes were terrible? Do we look at history to motivate our decision-making in the future? Remember, we talked about this being one of the potential biases that people and decision makers in particular bring to the table when they discuss what they should do for foreign policy decisions. This is the case with historical analogies. Just because we were not successful and we took too long and sent too small peacekeeping force in Rwanda doesn't mean that if another African country is experiencing a genocide that we should wait to see what happens. Maybe under that kind of a circumstance, we should act immediately because we know what can happen when we do not act. So these are all important questions to ask when we are deciding as a country whether it is appropriate, ethical, legal, and permissible to engage in humanitarian intervention. And make sure that at the conclusion of the lecture, you check out the video on humanitarian intervention or imperialism and also complete the message board assignment following that video.